Mother, I shot my commander to survive. Forgive me, this is my last letter. These are the final words of Gefreiter Karl Hoffmann, 6th Army, Army Group South, written in a foxhole outside Budapest as Soviet forces closed in from all directions. Found clutched in his frozen fingers by Private Werner Lang, who carried this secret through 56 years of nightmares before finally surrendering it to the Federal Archive. This is his testimony. This is his confession. This is his final attempt to transform murder into words that might somehow explain how survival can require the death of everything decent in the human soul. Don't let these voices be forgotten. Subscribe now so these words can reach others. Karl Heinrich Hoffmann was born March 18, 1925, in the village of Mittenwald, high in the Bavarian Alps where church bells echoed off snow-covered peaks and the air tasted of pine resin and eternal silence. His father, Heinrich, had been a woodcarver before the war, a man whose hands could transform dead timber into angels so lifelike they seemed ready to spread their wings and ascend to heaven. His mother, Greta, embroidered altar cloths for the village church and sang lullabies that could calm the fiercest alpine storms. Karl was the youngest of 3 sons, the boy who helped his father select wood from forests that had grown for centuries, and his mother thread needles by lamplight when winter nights stretched endlessly towards spring. His hands were blessed with his father's gift for creation, carving wooden toys that moved like living creatures, whittling crosses that seemed to glow with inner light, shaping beauty from material that had forgotten how to be beautiful. I shot him, Karl wrote in his confession, the words surrounded by pencil marks that looked like claw scratches. Hauptmann Müller, the man who taught me to read maps, to dig trenches that wouldn't collapse, to stay alive when everyone around me was dying. I shot him in the back of the head while he was praying. The war came to Mittenwald on Karl's 18th birthday, arriving with conscription notices that transformed celebration into mourning, birthday songs into funeral dirges. Karl was the last of his brothers to be claimed by the Wehrmacht. Heinrich had died at Stalingrad, Wilhelm had vanished in the forests of Belarus, and now Karl would follow them into the machinery of mass destruction that had consumed an entire generation of German boys. He trained at Grafenwehr for 5 months, learned to kill efficiently, march endlessly, follow orders without thinking or feeling or remembering that orders came from human beings who might be wrong, might be evil, might be leading their men toward damnation disguised as duty. The instructors emphasized absolute obedience above all else. Soldiers who questioned commands were dangerous. Soldiers who hesitated were traitors. Soldiers who put conscience above duty were enemies of the state. To survive, Karl wrote, returning again and again to the word that had become his God, his commandment, his only remaining moral principle. I told myself it was about survival, his life or mine, his fear or my fear, his death or my death. The arithmetic seemed simple until I realized that some equations destroy your soul even when they save your body. Karl's unit was assigned to Army Group South's desperate defense of Hungary, tasked with holding impossible positions against Soviet forces that outnumbered them 10-1 and had the advantage of unlimited supplies, superior equipment, and the righteousness that comes from defending your homeland against invaders. By January 1945, the German army was no longer fighting to win, but simply to delay inevitable defeat, to buy time for a miracle that everyone knew would never come. The retreat had been ongoing for 6 weeks, a chaos of abandoned equipment, scattered units, and soldiers who had forgotten everything except the need to keep moving west toward something that might still resemble safety. Karl's company had been reduced from 200 men to 37, then to 19, then to the 8 survivors who huddled in a foxhole outside Budapest while Soviet artillery turned the frozen ground around them into a landscape of craters and corpses. Forgive me, Mother, Karl wrote, addressing words to a woman who had raised him to create rather than destroy, who would spend her remaining years believing her son had died honorably serving the fatherland. Forgive me for forgetting everything you taught me about the sanctity of human life, for learning that survival can be more important than salvation, for discovering that fear can be stronger than faith. Hauptmann Stefan Müller had been Karl's commanding officer for 7 months, a Prussian career soldier who treated his men like sons and led by example rather than intimidation. Müller shared his rations when supplies ran short, carried wounded soldiers when they could no longer walk, made decisions based on protecting his men rather than following orders that might get them killed for no strategic purpose. Müller was 34 years old, married to a teacher named Anna, father of twin daughters he had not seen since 1943. He carried their photographs in his breast pocket, showed them to his soldiers during quiet moments, spoke about the life he planned to build when the war ended. Müller was everything a commanding officer should be: brave without being reckless, decisive without being rigid, compassionate without being weak. "I had no choice," Karl confessed, though the words felt like broken glass in his throat. "That's what I told myself when I put the pistol to the back of his head, when I squeezed the trigger, when I watched him fall face-first into the mud. I had no choice because choosing differently meant accepting death, and I wasn't ready to die." The crisis began on January 13, 1945, when Soviet reconnaissance units surrounded their position and demanded surrender. Müller gathered his 8 remaining men in the foxhole, explained their options with the calm precision that had kept them alive through months of impossible situations. They could surrender and face uncertain treatment as prisoners of war. They could attempt to break through Soviet lines and rejoin German forces 30 kilometers to the west. Or they could make a last stand and die fighting. Müller recommended surrender. The war was lost, he told them. Germany would fall within months, maybe weeks. There was no strategic value in dying for a cause that had already failed. No honor in sacrificing their lives for leaders who had abandoned them to fight impossible battles with inadequate resources. But surrender meant capture. Capture meant interrogation. Interrogation might reveal information about German defensive positions, troop movements, supply lines that could cost other German soldiers their lives. The SS had made it clear that soldiers who surrendered were traitors, that their families would be punished for their cowardice, that death was preferable to the shame of abandonment. "My mind refused to listen," Karl wrote, describing the moment when rational thought became impossible, when fear overwhelmed every other consideration. "I couldn't think about honor or duty or the greater good. I could only think about the Soviet prison camps, the interrogation rooms, the families of dead soldiers who would curse my name if I revealed secrets that got their sons killed." The argument lasted 47 minutes. Müller patiently explained why surrender was their only realistic option, why continuing to fight would accomplish nothing except adding 8 more names to casualty lists that already contained millions of German dead. But fear had replaced logic in the minds of men who had seen too much death, endured too much suffering, been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. 7 of the 8 soldiers agreed with Müller. They were ready to surrender, ready to accept captivity over death, ready to choose life over loyalty to a regime that had sacrificed their generation for the megalomaniacal dreams of leaders who would never face the consequences of their decisions. Karl was the only dissenter, not because he believed in Nazi ideology or thought the war could still be won, but because the idea of surrender terrified him more than the idea of death. In his 19-year-old mind, capture meant torture, collaboration meant eternal shame, survival meant betraying everyone who had died believing their sacrifice meant something. "This is my last letter," Karl wrote, acknowledging that some confessions can only be made by men who have already chosen death over continued living with unbearable guilt. "I write it because someone must know what happened in that foxhole. Someone must understand that murder can wear the mask of patriotism, that cowardice can disguise itself as courage, that the worst evil is often committed by people trying to do what they think is right." The moment that changed everything occurred at 23:47 hours on January 13, 1945. Müller was kneeling in the foxhole, praying quietly while his men prepared for surrender, when Karl realized that his commanding officer's decision would doom them all to capture, interrogation, and probable death in Soviet prison camps. Karl drew his sidearm without conscious thought, a movement so automatic it felt like muscle memory rather than deliberate choice. The Luger felt heavy in his hand, heavier than it had ever felt during training or combat, weighted with the knowledge of what he was about to do. Müller heard the metallic click of the safety being released, turned to look at Karl with surprise rather than fear. For 3 seconds, their eyes met across the narrow foxhole, and Karl saw recognition dawn in his commander's face. Not anger or betrayal, just sadness that one of his men had been broken by the war's relentless pressure. "Karl," Mueller said quietly, using his first name rather than his rank, speaking like a father to a son who was about to make a terrible mistake. You don't have to do this. We can find another way. But Karl's finger was already tightening on the trigger, his decision made by forces beyond conscious control, his actions driven by terror that had overwhelmed every other consideration. The shot echoed across the frozen battlefield at 23:49 hours, a sound that would replay in Karl's memory for the remaining 14 hours of his life. I see his eyes, Karl wrote, describing the image that had burned itself into his consciousness. Not angry eyes, not hateful eyes, just disappointed eyes that trusted me to make better choices, that believed I was capable of more courage than I possessed. The disappointment was worse than anger could ever have been. Mueller died instantly, the bullet entering the base of his skull and destroying the brain that had kept 8 men alive through 7 months of impossible warfare. His body fell forward into the mud, blood mixing with rainwater that had frozen into pink ice crystals that reflected moonlight like scattered rubies. The other 7 soldiers stared at Karl in shocked silence, unable to process what they had witnessed, unable to understand how their youngest member had murdered the officer who had protected them, guided them, treated them like family rather than expendable resources in someone else's war. We were brothers, Private Hans Weber whispered, the first words spoken after the gunshot echoed into silence. We were supposed to take care of each other. Karl felt no triumph, no relief, no satisfaction from eliminating what he had perceived as a threat to their survival. Instead, he felt only emptiness, a hollow sensation where his conscience had been, as if the bullet that killed Mueller had somehow ricocheted through his own soul and destroyed everything decent that had ever existed there. But the immediate problem remained unsolved. 7 soldiers and 1 murderer still faced the choice between surrender and death, and Mueller's elimination had only complicated their situation. Now they had to decide what to do with Karl, whether to turn him over to Soviet forces as evidence of their good faith, whether to execute him themselves as punishment for murdering their commander, whether to include him in whatever fate awaited them. If the story moved you, support this work so the truth continues to reach people. The remaining hours passed in stunned silence, punctuated by whispered arguments about justice, survival, and the weight of choices that would define whatever remained of their lives. Some wanted to shoot Karl immediately, to execute him for the murder of a beloved officer. Others argued that killing him would make them no better than he was, that justice belonged to courts rather than soldiers traumatized by endless violence. In the end, they made no decision at all. Soviet forces overran their position at dawn, capturing 7 soldiers and finding 1 body that had been shot in the back of the head at close range. Karl had used Mueller's death to buy himself 14 hours of life, 14 hours of breathing while his commander lay dead in frozen mud, 14 hours of existing with the knowledge that he had murdered the best man he had ever known. I don't know how to live with this, Karl confessed in handwriting that became increasingly erratic as he described the weight of guilt that had crushed his ability to function. How do you continue breathing when every breath is purchased with someone else's death? How do you wake up each morning knowing that a better man died so that a worse man could survive another day? Karl's confession reveals details about Wehrmacht discipline that military historians had only suspected. The psychological pressure that transforms soldiers into extensions of their officers' will, the complete breakdown of moral reasoning under extreme stress, the way fear could override every human instinct except the desperate need to keep living regardless of the cost. But the confession's most devastating passages are personal, describing Karl's recognition that he had become something monstrous not through ideology or hatred but through simple cowardice disguised as pragmatic thinking. He had killed Mueller not because he wanted to but because he lacked the courage to face the consequences of surrender, because fear had made him prefer murder to the possibility of his own death. He was praying when I shot him, Karl wrote, returning obsessively to the moment that had defined the last hours of his life, praying for our souls, for our families, for forgiveness for whatever sins we had committed in service of a cause that had forgotten how to distinguish between right and wrong. I shot him while he was asking God to have mercy on us. The irony was perfect and terrible. Karl spent his final hours writing, filling pages with details about Mueller's kindness, his tactical skill, his devotion to keeping his men alive through impossible circumstances. The letter became a memorial to the man he had murdered, a testament to everything decent that Karl had destroyed with a single moment of panic disguised as decisive action. "I was afraid," Karl wrote in the starkest admission of his confession. "Not afraid of death, which would have been honorable. Afraid of capture, of pain, of admitting that everything I had endured was meaningless. I killed Hauptmann Müller because I was afraid, and fear made me a coward, and cowardice made me a murderer." The confession contains no attempts at justification, no appeals for understanding, no claims that circumstances had made murder necessary. Karl accepted full responsibility for choosing to kill his commanding officer, acknowledged that fear was an explanation but not an excuse, recognized that some actions destroy the person who commits them even when they achieve their intended purpose. Soviet interrogators found Karl's body at 14:23 hours on January 14, 1945, frozen in the foxhole where he had spent his final night writing his confession. He had used his last bullet on himself, placing the muzzle under his chin and pulling the trigger rather than face capture and the questions that would have revealed his crime to the world. Private Werner Lang, the sole survivor of Karl's unit, discovered the confession while helping Soviet forces identify German casualties. Lang read the letter by the light of a burning tank, understood its implications, faced the choice between preserving evidence of his comrade's crime or protecting the reputation of a boy who had been destroyed by forces beyond his ability to control. Lang chose preservation over protection, hiding the confession in his personal kit where it remained for 56 years while he carried the weight of Karl's secret through marriage, fatherhood, and a long civilian career that never quite erased the memory of frozen foxholes and friends who had died for no comprehensible reason. The confession was discovered in 2001 when Lang's son was settling his father's estate, found among military memorabilia that included medals, photographs, and letters from comrades who had not survived the war. The son, Dr. Thomas Lang, was a professor of history at the University of Munich who understood the document's significance immediately. Karl's letter shows us the human cost of absolute obedience, Dr. Lang wrote in his analysis. It reveals how military systems can destroy moral reasoning, how fear can overwhelm conscience, how ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil when they lose the ability to distinguish between survival and honor. The confession was authenticated through handwriting analysis, cross-referenced with military records, verified against survivor testimony from Soviet archives that had been opened after the Cold War's end. Every detail checked out. The Sixth Army had fought in Hungary, units had been scattered during the retreat, soldiers had faced impossible choices between surrender and death. Karl's family was contacted and informed about his confession. His niece, Maria Hoffmann, was 63 years old when she learned the truth about her uncle's final hours. She read his words in her home in Mittenwald, surrounded by her grandfather's wood carvings and her grandmother's embroidered altar cloths, artifacts of a world that had been destroyed by the war that consumed Karl's generation. Uncle Karl was always the gentle one, Maria told Dr. Lang during their only interview. The boy who carved toys for us children, who helped grandmother with her needlework, who cried when he had to kill chickens for dinner. The war turned him into someone he was never meant to be, and it destroyed him as completely as if he had died in combat. The reaction to Karl's published confession was immediate and complex. Some readers condemned him as a traitor who had murdered his commanding officer for selfish reasons. Others saw him as a victim of circumstances that had pushed a 19-year-old boy beyond his psychological limits. Most struggled to find appropriate moral categories for a crime that defied easy judgment. But the most powerful response came from veterans who recognized their own capacity for similar choices. Soldiers wrote about moments when fear had overwhelmed training, when survival instincts had conflicted with military duty, when they had made decisions that saved their lives but destroyed their ability to live with themselves. Hauptmann Stefan Müller was posthumously awarded the Knight's Cross for his service during the Hungarian campaign, honored as an officer who had led by example and died fighting for his men. The citation made no mention of the circumstances of his death, preserving the fiction that he had fallen in combat rather than been murdered by one of the soldiers he had tried to protect. Müller's widow, Anna, received the medal at a ceremony in Munich, accepting it on behalf of her deceased husband and their twin daughters who had grown up without knowing their father. Anna never learned about Karl's confession, died in 1987 believing her husband had been killed by enemy action rather than betrayed by one of his own men. The twins, now elderly women with grandchildren of their own, were informed about their father's true fate when Karl's confession was published. They read his words with tears in their eyes, understanding for the first time why their father had never come home, why their childhood had been defined by absence rather than presence. "We forgive Karl," said Elizabeth Müller-Weber, speaking for herself and her sister, "not because what he did was right, but because we understand how the war destroyed everyone it touched. Our father died trying to save his men. Karl died trying to save himself. Both deaths were unnecessary. Both were caused by a system that valued ideology over human life." Karl's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about moral responsibility under extreme circumstances. How much pressure can human conscience withstand before it breaks? What happens when survival requires the betrayal of everything decent? When does fear become so overwhelming that it transforms ordinary people into killers? The foxhole where Karl shot Hauptmann Müller has long since been filled and covered with Hungarian soil that grows sunflowers and wheat, where German and Soviet soldiers once died for causes they barely understood. Local farmers sometimes uncover military artifacts while plowing: buttons, belt buckles, shell casings that remind them of the battle that transformed their fields into a graveyard. But memory persists where physical evidence has been buried. Hungarian historians have documented the retreat of Army Group South, preserved testimonies from civilians who witnessed the chaos, recorded the names of soldiers from both sides who died far from home for reasons that seem increasingly meaningless with each passing year. Karl's confession has become part of that preservation. Evidence that war's casualties include not just those who die in battle, but those who survive with psychological wounds that prove fatal years or decades later. His letter reminds us that the most dangerous enemy soldiers face is not the opposing army but the gradual erosion of their own humanity under pressures that transform moral individuals into instruments of destruction. The village of Mittenwald has erected a memorial to its war dead, a simple stone cross that bears the names of all the young men who never returned from military service. Karl's name appears among them, carved in stone that will endure long after everyone who knew him has died, preserved as part of a community's collective memory of loss. But Karl's true memorial is his confession, the 6 pages of desperate handwriting that capture the moment when fear overwhelmed conscience, when survival became more important than honor, when a 19-year-old boy learned that staying alive could require the death of everything good in his soul. The wooden angels that Karl's father carved still decorate the village church, their wings spread in eternal blessing over a congregation that has forgotten the hands that shaped them. Children born after the war look up at those angels and see only beautiful art, unaware that their creator's son died believing he was damned beyond redemption, beyond forgiveness, beyond hope. Subscribe so these forbidden stories never vanish again. Karl's confession teaches us that the line between hero and villain is often drawn in split seconds of decision, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary evil when pushed beyond their psychological limits, that understanding perpetrators is not the same as excusing their actions but is necessary if we want to prevent similar tragedies. The Bundesarchiv in Koblenz houses Karl's original confession in file 18477M, available to researchers who request access through official channels. The pencil marks have faded to gray, the paper has become brittle with age, but the words remain legible, preserved behind climate-controlled glass that protects them while ensuring they can still be read. Visitors pause before the display case, reading Karl's confession through protective barriers, trying to understand how fear could lead to murder, how survival could require the betrayal of trust, how a boy who carved wooden angels could shoot his commanding officer in the back of the head. The questions they ask reveal as much about themselves as about Karl. School groups want to know whether Karl was evil or just scared, whether his confession makes him better or worse than soldiers who committed similar acts without acknowledging them, whether they would have acted differently if faced with the same impossible choice between honor and survival. Teachers struggle to explain that fear and evil are not mutually exclusive, that understanding someone's motivation does not excuse their actions, that moral courage requires making difficult choices even when those choices might cost us everything we value. They try to help students recognize their own capacity for similar failures while encouraging them to choose differently when faced with similar tests. The most frequent question visitors ask is also the most disturbing. What would I have done? The honest answer is that most people would probably have made the same choice Karl did, that the psychological mechanisms that transformed a gentle woodcarver's son into a murderer operate on nearly everyone, that moral strength requires constant cultivation and can be destroyed by extreme circumstances. Karl's confession reminds us that protecting what is decent in human nature requires vigilance not just against external threats but against our own capacity for evil when we are afraid, when we are desperate, when survival seems to require the sacrifice of everything that makes survival worthwhile. The photograph that Hauptmann Müller carried of his twin daughters was found among his personal effects, blood-stained but still recognizable. The photograph now hangs in the Munich Military Museum, a reminder of what was lost when Karl chose fear over courage, survival over sacrifice, temporary life over eternal honor. In the silence after Karl's final words, we can still hear the echo of that gunshot in a frozen foxhole, still feel the weight of choices that transform protectors into killers, still taste the bitter recognition that the capacity for such betrayal exists in all of us, waiting for circumstances desperate enough to activate it. The sunflowers that grow in Hungarian fields where Karl and Müller died face east toward the rising sun, their golden faces following light across skies that have forgotten the sound of artillery, the screams of wounded soldiers, the whispered prayers of young men dying far from home. But the earth remembers, and the stories preserved in archives like Karl's confession ensure that memory survives even when witnesses die. File 18477M remains open in the Bundesarchiv, a permanent testament to the human cost of war, the psychology of betrayal, and the weight of choices that echo across generations. Karl's letter speaks to anyone willing to listen, asking uncomfortable questions about moral courage, the nature of evil, and the price of survival when that price includes the death of everything decent in the human soul. Some voices speak loudest from beyond the grave. Some confessions demand permanent witness. Some truths are too important to bury beneath comfortable myths about heroism and honor. Karl Hoffmann shot his commanding officer to save himself, then shot himself to escape what he had become. Both deaths were necessary. Both deaths were meaningless. Both deaths continue to teach us about the fragility of conscience under pressure and the terrible cost of choosing survival over everything that makes survival worthwhile. The wooden cross that Karl's father carved for their village church still hangs above the altar, its arms spread in eternal benediction over a congregation that includes the families of soldiers who never returned from war. The cross reminds worshippers of sacrifice, redemption, the possibility of forgiveness for even the worst sins. But Karl died believing he was beyond forgiveness, beyond redemption, beyond hope. His confession ends not with prayer, but with recognition that some choices create wounds that never heal, guilt that never fades, shame that follows its bearer into whatever darkness awaits those who betray everything they were raised to protect. Forgive me, Mother. I shot him to survive, and now I cannot survive what I have done.